They called me broke in front of the whole family. They laughed about my tiny apartment, my bus rides, my refusal to flaunt success. But the moment my father's eyes landed on the watch on my wrist, everything froze. In that instant, the secrets I'd guarded for years began to unravel. And by the end of the night, my family would never look at me the same way again. The private dining room hummed like a beehive pretending to be an orchestra. A muted chandelier threw gold across white linen, and waiters glided between chairs with the polite invisibility of ghosts. My family had taken the long table by the windows, the kind that telegraphed power to anyone who happened to glance in from the corridor. Champagne chimed. A violinist in the main hall wandered through a Sinatra standard, and the conversation spiraled upward into the right kind of laughter. Laughter that knew it was being watched. I took the last seat on the end, the one near the service station where a silver water pitcher sweated onto a tray. From here I could see everything. My mother's posture, perfect. My father's hands, steady. Uncle Richard's cufflinks, braggadocious. And Blake, my cousin, already mid-story, describing torque with the same reverence most people reserve for miracles. He was miming the way his new car handled a curve. You'd think it was the curve that had been blessed. 2.8 seconds, Blake announced, and a few heads turned as if numbers themselves could be dazzling. You don't hold the wheel holds you. Sounds unsafe, I said lightly, mostly to the salad in front of me. He heard anyway. Oh, Audrey, he laughed, the kind of laugh that arrived with an arm around your shoulder and a shove between your ribs. You still taking the bus to work, or did you finally upgrade to something with an engine and a soul? Across the table, my aunt smiled without her eyes. There's a charm to city buses, she added. Very community-minded. My mother shot her a glance that meant be kind. It was a look she used on other people, rarely on me. She turned to the waiter and touched her wineglass with 2 fingers, a silent plea for more burgundy and fewer opinions. This scallop is divine, Madison, another cousin, declared, because compliments keep the air sweet. You must try the truffle risotto, Audrey. It's small but rich, like minimalism with taste. The waiter placed a bowl before me, steam curling up in a ribbon. I thanked him. It smelled like memory couldn't afford it. Conversation ricocheted, an exchange about a villa in Capri, a complaint about custom cabinetry that arrived 2 shades too beige, the market's mood, which apparently had feelings and a favorite therapist. I watched my father during these moments. He listened, the way he always had, with his head slightly tilted and his eyes doing the math in the background. He's the only person I know who can make silence feel both generous and loaded. How's your little project? Uncle Richard asked me, as if he'd tripped over the word on the way to a better one. Still. Coding. Consulting. Collecting data. I can't keep track. It's going, I said. I didn't offer more. People only want details when they smell blood or profit. Nothing wrong with modesty, Blake said, flashing the smile that made waitstaff call him sir and friends confuse him for a good man. As long as modesty's a phase. A few seats down, my father's mouth tilted like he'd heard a joke only he understood. He looked toward me, briefly, then away. He was doing that a lot tonight, like a man checking a compass before deciding whether to change course. Darling, my mother murmured, leaning toward me, her perfume the expensive kind that pretends it isn't. Did you bring the Chanel I sent? The jacket? It would have photographed so well against these chairs. I'm comfortable, I said, smoothing the sleeve of my blouse. It wasn't Chanel. It wasn't anything you could name in a room like this. Madison lifted her phone, angle practiced. Everyone squeeze in, she sang, whether anyone squeezed or not. The camera chirped. Filters hummed. The moment became sharper than it had felt. She glanced at the screen. Cute. Audrey, you've got that understated thing down. Very deliberate. Understated is a choice, Blake said. Sometimes it's a budget. There it was. The room got brighter for a second, as if the chandelier approved. That's the trick with this family. There are jokes, and then there are jokes that are auditions for cruelty. You can feel the difference in your teeth. I set my fork down. Sometimes it's both, I told him, and took a sip of water, because water never asks you to be anyone. The sommelier arrived to perform the wine, as if it were a solo. Amber, Blake's sister, told a story about a Hamptons weekend that seemed to consist entirely of things being delivered to other things. A carved ice sculpture of a marlin, an oyster bar that wasn't a bar so much as an altar. Her laugh stuck to the ceiling like helium. Blake leaned back and scanned me with the benevolence of a man awarding points. So, he said, still in that apartment. The shoebox, with the nice view of a brick wall. It's a courtyard, I said. I respect that, he lied. It's just, why pretend a life is bigger by making it smaller? A couple of cousins laughed, reflexive, polite. My mother's hand found her napkin. She folded it once, then again, until it was a white square that could bandage any wound if it tried hard enough. Blake, my father said, voice even. It wasn't a warning. It was an introduction to the idea that a warning might be possible. He didn't look at me. He looked at the table, like he'd misplaced a thought there. Blake swirled his wine. I'm teasing. We all started somewhere. I just assumed by now you'd be... He made a gesture that tried to be gentle and landed as rude. His hand moved through the air like it owned the air. You know, upgrading. I felt heat climb my neck, traitorous and human. I made myself breathe the way my first mentor had taught me, slow and deliberate, to make room for better words to show up. Some upgrades don't show, I said. They're not supposed to. Poetry, he said. Look, I'm not judging. We just worry. You burn out, you fall behind. You need any help? He made help sound like a loan that would come with a plaque engraving his name on my life. Blake, Madison whispered, thrilled by the shape of this. Don't be awful. I'm not, he said, doing his best impression of not. I'm being family. Forks touched plates like someone had tuned them. A new course arrived. Something delicate and foamy that tasted like the idea of the ocean. The room had warmed. The windows showed a city washing its face in neon. I kept my wrist under the table, half out of habit, half out of superstition. It's funny how you can carry the most important thing you own and still find yourself trying to protect it from the very people who taught you what ownership means. Blake's grin reappeared, lazy, confident. Hey, he said, lifting his glass toward me. At least you've still got that watch. The classic, what did you call it, Mads? Vintage? Retro? Madison smirked. Timeless, I think. Right, Blake said. Timeless. Audrey's signature piece. Nothing says success like a keepsake that looks like it survived the Dust Bowl. The laughter came too easily this time. Someone snorted. Even my mother's mouth betrayed her with a tiny twitch before shame smoothed it over. I felt the laugh in my bones, the way a dropped glass echoes the moment before it shatters. I let it pass. You can't outrun a rumor about yourself, but you can walk the rumor until it gets bored. I lifted my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth, a learned choreography. The napkin trembled, just enough for me to hate it. Then my father turned. Not a quick glance, not curiosity in passing. He turned like a man hearing his name called in a crowd. His eyes went to my wrist, to the edge of metal peeking out from the cuff of my blouse. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the watch, as if the watch had been speaking this whole time, quietly, and he'd finally decided to listen. The air shifted. I felt it. So did my mother. Her chin angled, barely. Uncle Richard broke off mid-sentence about a partnership. Words spilled and went deaf on the table. Blake held his glass mid-air, like a man who'd forgotten what people do with gravity. My father's chair made the softest sound against the hardwood, the kind of sound you hear when you're trying too hard not to hear anything. He leaned a fraction of an inch. His fork rested on china. The waiter, on his way past with a tray of roasted beets shining like rubies, stopped and retreated as if he'd wandered into a confession. "Audrey," my father said, and the room obliged him by going quiet without anyone admitting they'd done it. He didn't blink. His voice was careful but sure, the tone he used when he knew the answer and wanted to see if you would tell the truth anyway. "Would you let me see your watch for a moment?" No one moved. Even the violinist outside skipped a note in sympathetic surprise. Somewhere in the building, ice met glass and went first. Blake laughed, small and forced. "Dad, Thomas, come on, it's a watch, not..." But my father didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on the stainless glint under my cuff, the way a person stares at a lighthouse and decides whether to turn the boat. And in that sliver of silence, the chandelier hummed, the city held its breath, and every story I'd refused to tell sat up inside me and waited to be chosen. I lifted my hand, pulse in my throat, metal cool against warm skin, and as the cuff slid back an inch, revealing the face that had watched me fight and build and fail and keep going, my father's eyes widened, recognition striking like a match in a dark room. "Is that..." he began, and the table leaned in as one, every word I hadn't said gathering behind my teeth, poised on a razor's edge. 3 years earlier, the world had felt like a hallway lined with doors I was supposed to walk through. Every one of them led to a place that made sense for someone else, but not for me. My parents' company had been the largest of those doors. Polished brass handle, thick glass, the Hayes name etched deep enough to last centuries. Everyone expected I would open it, step inside, and let the walls close around me. A vice president title waiting, salary that made strangers smile differently, and a lifetime of security I could have worn like armor. Instead, I turned away. Not dramatically, not in some movie-worthy blaze of independence. I just didn't step through. I said no to my father's offer, and yes, to something nobody in my family could quite picture. A struggling software startup in a cramped loft that smelled like burnt coffee and overworked circuitry. My mother was the first to speak after I told them. "You went to Harvard Business School," she said slowly, as if repetition might reset the conversation. "You had offers from 3 Fortune 500 companies. You had a choice," I interrupted. Her eyes hardened in the way only someone who loves you and thinks they know better can manage. "And you chose this?" She gestured vaguely, as if this was a patch of fog she couldn't clear. "It's an opportunity," I said. "It's a risk, yes, but it's mine." She looked at my father, waiting for him to save me from myself. But he just rubbed his jaw and said, "If you're going to do it, you'd better be ready to work harder than you've ever imagined." That was as close to approval as I was going to get. I stepped into the loft office 2 weeks later with a second-hand laptop, a mind full of ideas, and no clue how much grit would cost. The place buzzed with a kind of desperation that made you move faster just to keep from sinking. We were 12 people and a product nobody wanted yet, and the only thing we had in abundance was caffeine. It was in that chaos I met Gerald. He wasn't supposed to be there that day, just filling in for another advisor who'd missed a flight. The first time I saw him, he was leaning against a whiteboard, like it had personally wronged him, listening to a team pitch an idea that was dying mid-sentence. He didn't interrupt. He waited. And when the room fell silent, he asked one question that made half of us rethink the past 6 months. After the meeting, he found me by the window. "You're the only one who didn't look scared when I asked that question," he said. "I was terrified," I admitted. "I just didn't think it would help to show it." He smiled, slow and knowing. "Good. Fear's not the enemy. Complacency is." That was the start. He began stopping by more often, not because he had to, but because he said he liked the way I saw problems. Gerald was the opposite of my family. He had built and sold companies, made more money than he'd ever need, but he drove a 10-year-old sedan and wore sweaters so worn they could have been antiques. He didn't measure success in square footage or horsepower. He measured it in impact, what your work did for other people and what it did to you. One rainy Thursday, months into our friendship, he called me into the conference room. The blinds were drawn, the table bare except for a small wooden box. "Sit," he said. I did. "This," he began, pushing the box toward me, "has been with me through more wins and losses than I can count. It's not flashy. It's not even my most valuable possession, but it's the one I've kept closest." I opened the box to find a watch. Simple, elegant, with a kind of quiet authority in its design. The leather strap was softened by years of wear, the face clear and unpretentious. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. "It's rare," he corrected. "One of a handful I made myself before I started my first company. When I was your age, I thought making it meant never having to explain yourself to anyone. Took me a while to learn that making it means knowing exactly who you are, whether they understand you or not." I traced the edge of the watch with my fingertip. "I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "Wear it when you forget your worth. And never mistake their version of success for your own." I didn't know then how much I'd need those words. 3 months later, Gerald was gone. Heart attack. Sudden. Final. The news came on a Monday morning. I stared at my phone long after the call ended, the watch heavy on my wrist, as if it already knew the weight it would have to carry. The following weeks blurred. I buried myself in work, in code, in the relentless churn of deadlines. Every time someone doubted me, clients, investors, even my own team, I'd glance at that watch. It wasn't just time it measured. It was proof that someone like Gerald had believed in someone like me. Nobody in my family understood why I stayed at that startup. They asked at every holiday, every wedding, every chance encounter. "Still with that little company? When are you coming to your senses?" I learned to smile and change the subject. The truth was, I wasn't just staying. I was building. 2 years in, our product found its audience. A small client base at first, then more. Investors started to notice. By the time we were acquired, I'd already decided what to do next. I took my share of the buyout and started my own company. Quietly, no press releases, no champagne photos on LinkedIn, just work. And through it all, the watch stayed on my wrist. A silent rebellion, a reminder, a compass. It didn't care about anyone's approval but mine. Which is why, sitting at that table tonight, with Blake smirking across from me, my mother trying not to frown at my blouse, and my father stealing those quick glances. I knew exactly what that watch meant. The question was, did my father know too? It was late in the day, the kind of winter afternoon when the light thins out too early and you feel like you're losing time without noticing. The office was quieter than usual. Half the team had already left to catch trains before the snow started. Gerald had called me into the small, glass-walled conference room without saying why, just that we needed to talk. There was nothing on the table except a small wooden box, dark with age and smooth at the edges, like it had been opened and closed more times than anyone could count. He was standing by the window when I came in, one hand in his pocket, watching the first flakes drift past the streetlight. "Sit," he said, not turning around. His voice wasn't stern, but there was a gravity in it, the same tone he used when he was about to teach me something that wasn't in any business plan. I pulled out a chair and waited. When he finally turned, he was smiling faintly, the way he did when he knew he was about to surprise me. "Do you remember the first question I asked you the day we met?" he said. I thought back to that awkward pitch meeting, the whiteboard scribbles, the way my palms had been damp. "You asked me what problem I was trying to solve," I said. "Not the product." "The problem," he nodded. "And you didn't flinch." "I did. I just didn't let you see it." "Exactly." He stepped closer, resting his fingertips lightly on the lid of the box. "That's why I'm giving you this." I stared at the box. It wasn't big, maybe 6 inches across, the kind of size that could hold jewelry or a keepsake. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a watch. Not the kind you find under glass in a Fifth Avenue display, begging for attention. This one was understated, with a clean ivory face and a warm leather strap worn soft by years of use. The hands swept in a smooth motion, not ticking but gliding, like they weren't measuring seconds so much as moments. "It's beautiful," I said automatically, though the word didn't feel big enough. He smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "It's rare. One of 50 I made myself before my first company. Back when I thought time was something you could control if you worked hard enough." "You made this?" I looked closer, noticing the subtle details, the engraving on the back, the precise weight when I lifted it. "Gerald, I can't—" "Yes, you can," he interrupted, his voice cutting off any protest. "And you will. This watch has been with me through failures and wins, through nights I thought I'd lose everything, and mornings I couldn't believe what I'd built. It's the first thing I ever made that truly mattered to me. Then why give it away? Because I think you need it now more than I do." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat, leaning forward until his elbows rested on the table. "Audrey, there will be days ahead when everyone doubts you. Investors, clients, even people you love. They will measure you by numbers, by what you own, by how loudly you can shout your success. And if you're not careful, you might start measuring yourself the same way." I looked down at the watch again. The light from the street lamp outside caught the curved glass, making it glow faintly. "And this is supposed to remind me?" "It's supposed to anchor you," he said. "Wear it when you forget who you are, and don't ever mistake their version of success for yours." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I was thinking about how the strap felt against my skin, how the face was so simple yet impossible to ignore once you'd seen it. I was thinking about how I'd never owned anything that carried someone else's history, someone else's hours. "Okay," I finally said, "but only if you let me give it back someday." He shook his head, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "You won't want to. You'll understand why when the time comes." It was the last time I saw him in that conference room. 3 months later, he was gone. Just like that. A phone call in the middle of a Monday telling me he'd collapsed at home. I remember sitting at my desk, the watch heavy on my wrist, my fingers tracing the leather as if I could pull him back by touch alone. In the weeks after, I wore it every day, not as a piece of jewelry, but as a talisman. It was the first thing I put on in the morning, the last thing I took off at night. Whenever a deal fell through, or someone told me I wasn't ready, or I caught myself comparing my life to the ones in glossy magazines, I'd glance down and remember his voice. Wear it when you forget who you are. Nobody in my family knew where it came from. They saw it as a quirky accessory, maybe a sentimental trinket. If they'd asked, I would have told them the truth, but they never did. Maybe they didn't think it was worth asking about. Maybe they thought it didn't fit into the way they measured worth. And so, it stayed my secret. A quiet rebellion on my wrist. A piece of a man who had believed in me when believing was hardest. Which is why now, in this dining room, full of champagne glasses and voices that have never doubted their own right to be heard, the idea of my father recognizing it feels almost impossible. Impossible and dangerous. Because if he does, everything I've kept to myself might suddenly be on the table, and I'm not sure I'm ready for them to see it. The restaurant's private dining room had been reserved under my uncle's name, which meant nothing about it would be subtle. It was perched on the top floor of a glass-walled tower, with a view that made the city look like a model someone had lit from underneath. The table ran nearly the entire length of the room, draped in white linen, and crowned with vases of orchids that were probably flown in from somewhere that cost more to visit than my annual rent. It smelled faintly of truffle oil and perfume, a blend designed to make you feel like you should be on your best behavior whether you wanted to or not. I arrived just late enough that most of the seats were already taken. The maitre d' ushered me in with that particular smile that said, "You don't look like the others, but you must belong because your name is on the list." I could feel eyes tracking me before I reached my chair. Side glances, quick assessments, the silent slide from my boots up to my plain blouse, a flicker of polite disapproval before attention moved on. Blake was mid-story again, laughing with that calculated volume that forced everyone within 20 feet to know he was entertaining. And then I told him, "If you can't afford the membership, maybe you shouldn't be on the course in the first place." The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind that punctuates the air without actually touching anyone's lungs. I slipped into my seat at the far end, near the service door. A waiter filled my glass with water, leaning just close enough to murmur, "Still sparkling?" And I nodded, grateful for the small acknowledgement that I was here, breathing, even if the room had yet to notice. To my right, Aunt Pamela was describing the renovation on her little summer place in the Hamptons, a phrase so at odds with itself, I nearly smiled. And of course, the imported marble arrived chipped. Can you imagine? We had to send back the entire shipment. 3 weeks delay. Honestly, I don't know how people live without a good contractor. Across from her, Madison, Blake's younger sister, was scrolling through photos on her phone. We had the chef from Amalfi come to the villa for the weekend. You must try the sea bass. It's flown in daily. She didn't look up once. The menu in front of me might as well have been a performance program. Each course was a list of ways to spend as much as possible on as little as possible. I closed it. I wasn't here for the food. Blake's eyes found me from halfway down the table. "Audrey," he said in the tone you use when you're setting someone up. "Still, riding the bus? Or have you finally graduated to something with 4 wheels and your name on the title?" A few people chuckled. My mother's lips pressed into the faintest line, but she didn't interrupt. This was how these dinners worked. The casual jabs disguised as concern, the subtle reminders of where you stood in the family's invisible hierarchy. "I like the bus," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's good for the environment, and parking in the city is a nightmare." "Of course," he replied with mock understanding. "It's just, when you work as hard as you do, shouldn't you enjoy the fruits of your labor? Life's short." Amber, his sister, leaned in as though to add something, but was distracted by the waiter placing a plate of oysters in front of her. She clapped her hands softly. "Perfect," she said. Then to me, "You should try one, fresh from Montauk this morning." I shook my head with a smile. "Maybe later." Down the table, my father was engaged in a measured conversation with Uncle Richard about some investment firm's expansion strategy. I caught him looking toward me once, briefly, before returning to his wine. His glances were never casual. They always meant something was ticking in his mind. As the first course arrived, conversation swelled again. Stories of ski trips, luxury cars, business deals that sounded more like stage plays than real events. Each one came with its own rhythm, the setup, the humble brag, the punchline that wasn't really a joke. I'd been to enough of these to know my role. Listen, smile when required, offer just enough detail about my life to seem cooperative without inviting deeper questions. Aunt Pamela leaned across the table, her diamonds catching the light. "How's your... what is it? Consulting work?" "Software," I said. "Yes, of course. And that's... keeping you afloat?" "It's going well," I replied simply. "Good, good," she said, as though she'd been responsible for the outcome. "But if you ever feel ready for something more stable, I'm sure your father could find you a place at the company." I nodded politely, letting her think what she wanted. Stability was just another word for stuck, but this wasn't the room for that conversation. From somewhere down the table, Blake's voice rose again. "We should all take a trip together this summer. Capri, maybe. Everyone gets their own villa. Even you, Audrey, if you promise not to get there on the ferry." Laughter again, light but sharp. I glanced at my mother. She gave me the faintest shake of her head, as if to say, "Don't rise to it." I didn't. But under the table, my thumb brushed against the leather strap of my watch, feeling the smooth edge where the years had worn it soft. My father was watching me now, not Blake, just watching. And for the first time that night, I thought I saw the faintest spark of recognition in his eyes, like he was putting together a puzzle he hadn't realized was missing a piece. I looked away, before I could tell whether I was imagining it. Because if I wasn't, that spark might be the beginning of a conversation I'd spent years avoiding, and one I wasn't sure I could control once it started. The second course had barely been cleared when Blake decided it was time to put me back on the menu. He leaned forward in his chair, the stem of his wine glass resting between two fingers, his smile all teeth and self-assurance. "So, Audrey," he began, his voice pitched just loud enough to rope in the half of the table that wasn't already listening, "still living in that little apartment of yours. What is it? 500 square feet, give or take, with the charming view of the brick wall." The ripple of laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to sting. Even my aunt tried to stifle hers with a sip of water, though it did nothing to hide the way her eyes sparkled with amusement. I forced a small smile. "It's 600, I said evenly, "and it's a courtyard, not a wall." Blake chuckled, as if I'd just proved his point. "Right. Still, doesn't it ever get claustrophobic? I mean, you work so hard. Don't you think it's time you upgraded? Or is this your thing now, like some sort of minimalist experiment?" Across from me, Madison tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and pity. "It must be grounding, though," she said, as if she were trying to help. Living like normal people. I could feel the warmth rise in my face, but my voice stayed calm. "It's convenient. I like being close to work." "Oh, come on," Blake pressed, swirling the deep red in his glass as though he were about to toast to my surrender. "You can't tell me you don't want more space, maybe a place where you don't have to hear your neighbor's every conversation through the wall." My mother's hand twitched on her napkin. "Blake," she said lightly, the warning hidden under a layer of etiquette. "We don't need to dissect Audrey's living arrangements." He smiled at her in mock contrition, then turned back to me. "I'm just saying, there's a difference between frugality and unnecessary suffering. Public transportation, tiny apartment. What's next? Growing your own vegetables on the fire escape." A few people laughed again. The noise swelled and died like a wave pulling back from shore. I wanted to tell him that what he saw as deprivation was actually choice, that my life was exactly the size I wanted it to be. But I knew that would only feed his performance. Instead, I let my hand drift under the table, my fingers brushing the leather strap on my wrist, the familiar grain of it like a steadying heartbeat. The watch wasn't a shield, not really, but it was an anchor. And right now, I needed anchoring. Blake wasn't finished. "Seriously, though," he continued, leaning back like he had all the time in the world, "what's the point of working if you don't enjoy the rewards? Life's short, Audrey. You can't take the money with you." From down the table, my father's voice came, even but carrying. "Some people measure rewards differently." It wasn't an argument, just a statement, but it landed between Blake and me like a small, unexpected weight. Blake shot him a quick glance before smirking at me again. "Sure. But still, it wouldn't hurt to indulge yourself once in a while. You work in, what was it again? Software? Consulting? Must pay something." The conversation around us slowed, other voices quieting to see where this was going. I could feel the familiar pattern setting in. Blake asking questions designed to box me in, the family listening for the right combination of humility and defensiveness, the unspoken competition dressed up as concern. "Enough to keep me happy," I said. He grinned, as if I'd confirmed what he already believed, that I was just getting by, that my modesty was born from necessity rather than choice. "Well, I guess as long as you're comfortable." There was an edge under the words, one only I seemed to hear. My fork paused mid-air, the silver tines catching the light, and for a moment I thought about saying something that would end this game entirely. One sentence could flip this table on its head. But then my father's eyes caught mine, steady, watchful, unreadable, and I let the moment pass. Blake raised his glass in my direction, a mock salute. "To comfort," he said, the toast ringing faintly with its own smugness. I clinked my water glass against the rim of his wine, the hollow sound between us like an echo in an empty room. And that was when I noticed my father looking, not at my face, not at Blake, but at my wrist. The conversation had been humming along in that way family dinners often do. One part performance, one part competition. When I realized my father wasn't listening to Blake anymore. He wasn't pretending to sip his wine or waiting for an opening to steer the talk towards safer waters. He was looking at my wrist, not casually, not the way you glance at someone's outfit and then forget it. His gaze was fixed, almost searching, and I knew instantly what he was seeing. I tried to lower my hand discreetly, folding it into my lap, but it was too late. He had already leaned forward slightly, one forearm resting on the edge of the table, his eyes narrowing, in that precise way they did, when he was putting numbers together in his head. The chatter around us blurred. I could still hear the clink of cutlery, the muted laughter from the other end of the table, but it felt far away. "Is that—" His voice cut through Blake's next comment, firm but not loud. The way he spoke made the people closest to us instinctively pause, forks mid-air. My father kept his eyes on me. "Audrey, would you let me see your watch for a moment?" I froze, caught between the urge to shrug it off and the knowledge that shrugging it off would only make it more conspicuous. All down the table, heads began to turn. My mother tilted her chin toward me, her expression unreadable. Blake blinked, momentarily thrown off by the interruption to his little stage. "It's just a watch," I said lightly, though I could feel the air shifting around us. "Yes," my father replied, his voice steady, "but I think I've seen it before." Blake smirked. "What? Are we appraising jewelry now? Should I pass mine down for inspection too?" A few scattered chuckles broke the tension, but my father didn't look away. "Please," he said. Not a command, not quite a request, something in between. I slipped my hand from my lap and slowly pushed my sleeve up, just enough for the light to hit the watch's face. He leaned closer, and I saw the moment recognition hit him. His breath caught almost imperceptibly, his fingers brushing the edge of the leather strap with a kind of reverence I hadn't expected. "This is a Gerald Clean original," he said quietly, but his words carried. Conversation at the table thinned even further. "From his early limited series, there can't be more than, 50 of these in existence?" The name landed like a stone in a still pond. People reacted in small, visible ways. Eyebrows lifted, wine glasses lowered. Someone whispered, "The tech guy?" Blake frowned, not yet understanding. "You mean that eccentric billionaire who lived like a monk? He made watches?" "Before the tech world," my father said, still studying the timepiece. "He was a horologist. Built every one of these by hand. They're rare." He glanced up at me, his eyes sharp with something that felt like a mix of curiosity and pride. "How did you come to own this?" The question hung there, surrounded by an audience that suddenly found me far more interesting than they had 15 seconds ago. My mother's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Aunt Pamela leaned in ever so slightly. I considered deflecting, but there was no point now. The watch had outed me. "He gave it to me," I said simply. There was a beat of silence, then a few incredulous murmurs. My father's brow furrowed. "Gerald Clean gave you this watch?" I nodded. "Before he died." "He was my mentor, my first investor." Aunt Pamela blinked as though she'd misheard me. "Investor? In what?" I glanced at Blake, who was looking between us with something close to irritation. "My company," I said. The word felt heavy in the room, as if I'd just thrown it onto the table between the oysters and the silverware. For years I had dodged their curiosity, kept the details vague. Now, with my father's gaze still locked on me, and this watch on full display, I could see there was no going back. Blake forced a laugh, but it was thinner now. "Well, isn't that something? Guess the bus rides paid off after all." But my father wasn't smiling. He was still holding my wrist lightly, his thumb brushing over the smooth curve of the watch's casing. "Do you have any idea?" he said, his voice quieter now but tinged with something fierce. "What this is worth?" I met his eyes. "Yes. But that's not why I wear it." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost approval, almost something else. "Still," he said, sitting back, It's not the kind of thing you see on just anyone's wrist. Most of these are in private collections or museums. I could feel the rest of the table leaning in, waiting. They wanted the story, the whole thing, and they weren't going to let it go now. My father seemed just as unwilling to move on, and I knew in that exact moment that the watch wasn't just about to change the conversation, it was about to change the balance of power in this room. The weight of my father's words hung over the table like a low ceiling. The clinking of forks had stopped. Even the hum of conversation from other tables in the restaurant seemed muffled, as if the whole floor was leaning in. He let go of my wrist slowly, as though releasing something fragile, but his eyes stayed on me. "So," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, "you have one of 50 watches handmade by Gerald Clean, and you didn't think to mention this?" The corner of my mouth curved faintly. "You never asked." That earned me a few polite chuckles, but the tension was still there, stretching across the white tablecloth. Blake shifted in his seat, clearly irritated that the spotlight had been stolen from him. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone dripping with false casualness. "But are we talking about the Gerald Clean? The guy who built that ridiculous software empire and lived in a shoebox on purpose?" My father's eyes flicked to him, a silent reminder that this was not his turn to speak. "Yes," he said. "That Gerald Clean." Then back to me. "And he was your mentor?" I nodded. "My mentor, my first investor, and the reason I'm still doing what I'm doing today." Aunt Pamela tilted her head, her voice laced with skepticism. "Investor?" "In what, dear?" "My company." The ripple of surprise around the table was unmistakable. It was the sound of a dozen people recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. Blake laughed once, sharp and short. Wait. You've never said a word about owning a company. What kind of company?" I could feel all of them staring, and for a second, I almost slipped back into my well-practiced habit of evasion. But something about the way my father was watching me, steady, curious, maybe even a little proud, made me decide against it. "We build predictive analytics platforms," I said. "Started small, working with independent retailers, and now we've expanded to healthcare systems and government agencies." There was a pause before Uncle Richard, who rarely spoke to me beyond obligatory greetings, chimed in. "Government agencies? Which ones?" "Several," I replied. "Including a contract we finalized last month with the federal government." My mother blinked, her expression caught between astonishment and confusion. "Federal? As in Washington?" "As in the largest deal we've ever signed," I said. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't dismissal. It was recognition. Madison leaned forward, her diamond necklace catching the light. "How large are we talking?" I looked her directly in the eye. 900 million, over 5 years. The gasp was audible. Blake actually choked on his wine, coughing until Amber reached over and patted his back with exaggerated sympathy. Uncle Richard set his fork down, his face frozen in something that was almost admiration, though he'd probably never admit it. Blake recovered quickly, or at least tried to. 900 million, huh? That's impressive. His voice was tight, the easy arrogance replaced with something harder to pin down. "It's more than impressive," my father said quietly. And now everyone was listening to him again. "It's extraordinary, especially for someone who's managed to keep it under the radar this long." I shrugged. I never saw the point in announcing it. Gerald taught me that the moment you feel the need to prove your worth to others is the moment you've forgotten your actual worth. For a moment, There was nothing but the faint clink of a spoon somewhere down the table. Then, as if a switch had flipped, the mood began to shift. People who had barely acknowledged me when I walked in were now leaning in, asking questions about the company, about Gerald, about what came next. Even my mother, who still looked mildly disoriented, softened her voice when she asked, "And you've been successful all this time, without telling anyone?" "I've been focused," I corrected. The rest of the meal turned into a strange sort of courtship. They wanted pieces of the story, each trying to find a way to connect themselves to it. Uncle Richard brought up a mutual acquaintance in the tech world. Madison suggested I should meet her husband's investment partners. Blake, of all people, asked if I'd ever considered branching into fintech. Through it all, I kept my tone measured, my answers polite but clipped. I wasn't going to turn this dinner into a business meeting, no matter how badly they wanted me to. At one point, Blake leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "I guess I underestimated you." I met his gaze, steady. "Yes, you did." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Well, at least you've proven me wrong in style." His eyes dropped briefly to the watch before meeting mine again. "Gerald must have thought the world of you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. From the other end of the table, my father's voice rose again, not loud but deliberate. "This family has always measured success in certain ways. Maybe it's time we broaden that definition." A murmur of agreement rippled around, though whether it was genuine or just an instinct to follow his lead, I couldn't tell. What I did know was that something fundamental had shifted. The hierarchy of this table had been rewritten in the space of 20 minutes, and for once, I wasn't on the lowest rung. But as the plates were cleared and dessert menus appeared, I realized that shifts like this come with a cost, and I was about to find out exactly what mine would be. The dessert menus were still in the waiter's hands when Aunt Pamela leaned forward, her pearls catching the candlelight like tiny moons. 900 million, she repeated, as if saying it again might make the number more digestible. Well, dear, that's remarkable. I had no idea your work was at that level." I sipped my water, letting her words hang there. "It's not just about the size of the contract. It's about what it will accomplish." Blake tilted his head, his tone carefully casual. "And what exactly is that? You never really explained what your company does, not in detail." I could feel the whole table waiting, not for a technical breakdown, but for the part of the story that might satisfy their curiosity or their skepticism. I set my glass down. "We build predictive analytics platforms. It's software that helps organizations use their data to make better decisions. In the beginning, we worked with small businesses, mom-and-pop shops, local nonprofits, people who were often overlooked by larger tech firms. Now, we've expanded to healthcare systems and government agencies." Uncle Richard's brows drew together, his skepticism barely veiled. "Government agencies aren't known for working with small players. How did you manage to land something like that?" I met his gaze evenly. "By proving we could do the job better than companies 10 times our size. We didn't have the marketing budget or the political connections they did, but we had the results. We won the bid because our solution was faster, more adaptable, and significantly more cost-effective." Madison swirled her wine, clearly fascinated. "And Gerald? He was part of this from the beginning?" "Yes," I said. "He was my first investor. He gave me $500,000 on nothing but a handshake. No contracts, no lengthy negotiations. Just trust." My mother's voice was quiet, but I heard the undercurrent of disbelief. $500,000? And you didn't think to tell us?" It wouldn't have changed anything, I replied. You would have still worried I was making a mistake, and maybe I was, but it was mine to make. Blake let out a short laugh, not mocking this time, but almost incredulous. And you turned that into $1 billion company. Without... He cut himself off, the sentence unfinished but obvious. Without help from the family. Without the kind of help you mean? Yes, I said. Across the table, my father was watching me again, his expression unreadable but intent. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, connecting pieces he hadn't realized belonged to the same puzzle. And this contract, he said slowly, what does it mean for the future? It means stability, growth, and it means we can expand the reach of the foundation I started last year. Amber perked up. Foundation? I nodded. The Klein Foundation for Technological Equity. We provide comprehensive tech education and mentorship to students from under-resourced communities. Scholarships, equipment, internships. Our first group is already halfway through the program. Aunt Pamela gave a small, approving nod, as though she were granting me entry into a club I hadn't applied to join. That's commendable. It's necessary, I said simply. Gerald believes success came with responsibility. I agree. There was a beat of silence. It wasn't hostile, just contemplative. The kind of pause that comes when people realize the story they've been telling themselves about someone doesn't quite fit anymore. Blake broke it with a half smile. You know, I'll admit I've given you a hard time over the years. I guess I figured if you weren't flaunting your success, it meant you didn't have any to flaunt. I arched a brow. And now? He hesitated, then shrugged. Now, I'm wondering if maybe you had the right idea all along. The waiter appeared with a tray of desserts. Small, perfect things, arranged like jewelry and porcelain. Plates were set down, silver spoons laid out, but the conversation stayed fixed on me. Questions kept coming. How many employees I had, where our offices were, what kind of clients we served. I answered what I wanted to, left out what I didn't. Through it all, my father stayed mostly quiet, but I could feel his attention like a steady weight. Not judgment this time. Something else. Something heavier. When the plates were nearly empty and the coffee arrived, he finally spoke again. You've built something remarkable, he said, and for the first time, there was no surprise in his voice, only certainty. And you did it on your own terms. I met his eyes. That was always the point. A faint smile touched his mouth, but it didn't last long. He glanced down at my watch again, then back at me, and there was a question there he hadn't asked yet. I could see it forming, waiting for the right moment. And I knew when it came, it wouldn't just be about the watch. It would be about everything I'd kept from them. The coffee had barely cooled before the shifting began. It was subtle at first. Chairs angled just slightly toward me, conversations leaning closer. The occasional glance traded over someone's wine glass before they found a way to slip into my orbit. People who, an hour ago, could barely remember the name of the company I ran were suddenly eager to know everything about it. Uncle Richard was the first to make his move. He rested one elbow on the table, his voice pitched low enough to make it seem like he was confiding in me, rather than angling for information. You know, he said, Westfield's been exploring some technology partnerships. There might be synergy between what you're doing and a few of our projects. We should talk. It was meant to sound generous, as though he were offering me a gift, but I knew better. I'd seen that same look in boardrooms. Men, accustomed to being gatekeepers, suddenly realizing the gate had been moved without their permission. I smiled politely. I'll have my team reach out if it makes sense. Across from him, Madison perked up. Oh, and my husband's firm is always looking for innovative platforms to invest in. Maybe you could come to one of our networking dinners. Just a casual thing, but you'd meet some great people. The irony of her invitation wasn't lost on me. I'd been to those dinners before, as someone's plus one, and had been treated like background noise while the great people talked over me. I gave her the same polite nod. I'll think about it. Even Blake tried his hand at a softer approach. He leaned toward me, his expression somewhere between awkward and sincere. Look, Audrey, I owe you an apology. I've been, well, kind of an ass over the years. You've been consistent, I said, my tone dry but not cruel. He winced. Fair. But seriously, I didn't know. I mean, I assumed if you weren't talking about your success, there wasn't much to talk about. Guess I was wrong. I tilted my head, studying him. Would you still be apologizing if my company was worth $10,000 instead of nearly $2 billion? He hesitated just long enough for the answer to be obvious. That's a fair question, he admitted. I guess I've been measuring people by the wrong metrics. I didn't let him off the hook with a smile. Maybe it's time to stop doing that. He nodded, looking more subdued than I'd ever seen him. Maybe it is. The strange thing was, I wasn't angry anymore. Whatever irritation I'd felt earlier had been replaced by something colder, something like clarity. These sudden overtures, these invitations, they weren't about me. They were about proximity to whatever they thought I had, now that they'd decided it was valuable. As the servers cleared the last of the dessert plates, the energy around the table had shifted completely. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was a courtship ritual, with me as the unexpected guest of honor. Questions came from every direction. What markets were we targeting next? Was I considering an IPO? Would I be expanding internationally? Each one was framed as curiosity, but I could feel the calculations running beneath the words. I kept my answers measured, never offering more than I wanted them to know. My father watched in silence, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he recognized exactly what I was doing. By the time the check arrived, paid for by my father, as tradition dictated, the air was thick with a new hierarchy. The cousins who'd smirked at my bus rides were now eager to be seen talking to me. The aunts who'd once dispensed unsolicited career advice were suddenly validating my choices. It was almost dizzying, the speed with which people could rewrite their stories about you when they thought it might benefit them. As we stood to leave, Blake caught my arm. If you ever want to, I don't know, collaborate on something, let me know. I think I could learn a lot from you. I glanced at his hand on my sleeve until he removed it. If I decide you could, I said, I'll call you. He laughed softly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in it. Fair enough. By the time we reached the coat check, I felt the room still buzzing behind me. The dinner had started with me as the quiet one at the end of the table, someone to be teased for her small apartment and her bus pass. It ended with me as the gravitational center, pulling eyes and questions toward me, like I'd been holding court my whole life. But as I slipped into my coat, I caught my father watching me from across the lobby. There was something in his expression, thoughtful, yes, but also calculating, that made me pause. It wasn't the look of a man who had just learned something about his daughter. It was the look of a man who was about to ask a question that might change everything. The lobby was still warm from the dinner crowd, a low hum of voices drifting from the bar, the scent of coffee and expensive perfume clinging to the air. My family was filtering toward the exit in small clusters, each group pausing for coats, air kisses, or one last round of small talk. I was almost at the door when I felt a light tap on my arm. "Walk with me," my father said, his voice low enough to make it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I slowed my pace, letting him fall in step beside me. We moved toward a quieter hallway off to the side, away from the glass doors where the valet attendants were calling out names. The carpet muffled our steps, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, the way he used to when I was a kid, and he was trying to decide if I'd done something wrong or something impressive. "That was unexpected," he said finally. "What was?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. He gave me a sidelong glance. "The way you handled yourself tonight. The way you kept control of the conversation, even when they were circling like sharks." I shrugged. "It's not my first time in a room like that." "No," he said. "But it's the first time I've seen you in one, and realized you didn't need me there." There was no bitterness in his tone. If anything, it was closer to admiration, tinged with something quieter. We reached a spot near a large framed photograph of the city skyline, the kind that was supposed to look candid but had clearly been staged. My father stopped there, turning to face me. "You've kept a lot from us." "From you?" I corrected. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't want my choices to be judged through the family filter." His brows drew together. "And what's that filter, exactly? The one where success is measured by how big your house is, how new your car is, how loudly you can talk about your wins without sounding like you're bragging. I wanted to build something without having to prove its worth to anyone before it was ready." He considered that for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You sound like Gerald." I smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." His gaze dropped to my wrist again, to the watch that had started all of this. "I'm guessing there's more to that story than you told at the table." "There's always more to the story," I said. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "Fair enough. Still, I wish I'd known sooner. Not because I could have helped, not in the way you think, but because I would have liked to see it happen, to see you building something that mattered to you. You would have tried to protect me from the hard parts," I said gently. "Maybe," he admitted. "That's what fathers do." He hesitated, then added, "But you didn't need protecting, did you?" "No," I said. "I needed space." For a long moment we just stood there, the muted sounds of the lobby fading into the background. His eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen in years, maybe decades. "You've done well," he said finally. "Better than I could have imagined. And you've done it without compromising who you are. That's rare." I felt something in my chest loosen at his words, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded, then glanced toward the lobby where the rest of the family was still gathered. "They're going to treat you differently now. You know that." "I know," I said, "and I don't like it." "Neither do I," he replied, "but maybe it's an opportunity for them to see a different kind of success. For you to decide how much of yourself you want to share." We started walking back toward the lobby, the sounds of the evening creeping back in. I thought the conversation was over, but as we reached the edge of the carpet, he stopped again. "By the way," he said, his voice quieter now, "that watch, when we get a chance, I want to hear the full story, not the dinner table version." I met his gaze. "You'll get it, but not tonight." His eyes held mine for a beat, then he gave a small nod, as if accepting terms to a deal. We rejoined the others, stepping back into the swirl of polite laughter and cold air from the open doors. And as we walked out into the night, I realized that while the balance had shifted at the dinner table, the real reckoning was still ahead, because the next time my father asked about Gerald's watch, it wouldn't be a casual question. It would be the one that forced me to decide just how much truth I was willing to give. 3 weeks after that dinner, I was back in my office, sunlight spilling across my desk in long rectangles. The city was alive outside my window, but inside it was calm. The kind of morning where the hum of the HVAC and the muted tapping of keyboards felt like a rhythm you could work to for hours. I'd been going over the final budget for the Foundation's new mentorship program when my assistant poked her head in. "Your 10 o'clock is here," she said. I stood, smoothing the sleeve of my blazer. "Send her in." A minute later, Zoe stepped through the door, a 16-year-old with a fierce, almost defiant posture, wearing a thrifted jacket over a t-shirt with a local non-profit's logo. She clutched a worn notebook in one hand. Her eyes darted around my office, taking in the framed photographs of our team with clients, the simple furniture, the absence of the flashy art pieces so many tech executives use to signal their success. "You can sit anywhere you like," I said, gesturing to the 2 chairs in front of my desk. She sat stiffly, placing her notebook on her lap. "Thanks for meeting with me," she began. Her voice was steady, but her fingers fidgeted against the cover. I read about the Foundation's programs, and I think what you're doing is important. So I wanted to show you my project idea." I leaned forward, genuinely curious. "Tell me about it." She opened her notebook to a page filled with messy diagrams and bullet points. "It's about food insecurity in urban neighborhoods. I want to build a system that maps out where people don't have access to affordable groceries, using data from public records, transportation routes, even store inventory APIs. Then we could connect that data to local food banks and delivery services to close the gap." I found myself smiling. "That's ambitious." "I know," she said quickly, "but my family relies on food assistance, and I've seen how complicated it can be. People don't just need food, they need access. And the people designing solutions, they don't always understand the barriers." Her passion was disarming. I saw flashes of myself in her, the same mixture of certainty and urgency I'd had when Gerald first noticed me across a conference room table. "You've thought about the technical requirements?" I asked. She nodded. "I've been teaching myself Python and working with some free data visualization tools, but I know it's not enough. I need help. Mentorship." I leaned back, feeling the smooth press of Gerald's watch against my wrist. "How would you feel about being the first participant in our new direct mentorship program?" Her eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Completely. You'd work with our data science team 1 afternoon a week, developing your project with professional guidance. We'd also provide a stipend, so you don't have to worry about losing hours at your part-time job." For a moment, she just stared at me, and then she smiled, a quick, almost startled smile, like she wasn't sure it was allowed. That would change everything for me." "Good," I said, "because your idea could change a lot for other people too." We spent the next half hour going through her notes, refining ideas, talking about who she'd need to interview, what data sets might be available, which pitfalls to anticipate. She left with a clearer plan and a spark in her eye that hadn't been there when she arrived. After she was gone, I sat for a moment, staring at the closed door. The office felt quieter somehow, but not empty, like the space was holding on to the energy she'd left behind. I looked down at my watch, the same one Gerald had given me on that rainy Thursday years ago. His words echoed in my mind. "Wear it when you forget your worth." There was a knock and my assistant peeked in again. "Your father's on line 1, says it's important." I picked up the phone, leaning back in my chair. "Hi, Dad." "I heard about the mentorship program," he said without preamble. "Your mother's been talking about it since she saw something in the paper. I'd like to be involved." I hesitated. "Involved how?" "Not just financially, though I can make a contribution," he said. "I want to give my time. I've been in business long enough to know a few things that might help these students, negotiation, leadership, strategy, and I suspect I'd learn a thing or two from them in return. Something in my chest warmed at that. They'd benefit from your experience, I said honestly. There was a pause on the line, softer now. The dinner, it made me reevaluate how I measure success, not just in you, but in myself. I want to be part of something that lasts beyond balance sheets and property portfolios. I smiled to myself. Welcome to the team. We ended the call with plans for him to meet the first group of students next month. I hung up and sat there for a while, watching the light shift across the office floor, thinking about how one night, one unexpected moment, could ripple outward in ways you couldn't predict. I had chosen to live by Gerald's philosophy, to measure success by the impact you create, not the noise you make. And now, somehow, that choice was influencing more than just my own life. The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't my assistant. It was a number I hadn't seen in years, one that made my pulse quicken before I even picked it up. The call had been short, almost abrupt. A voice from my past, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten before my brain could even process it. I promised myself I'd think about it later, but for the rest of the day, the echo of it stayed with me, tucked somewhere between my ribs and the steady tick of Gerald's watch on my wrist. By the time I left the office that night, the city had folded itself into its winter skin. The sidewalks were glossy with melted snow, streetlights cutting cones of gold through the cold air. I walked the few blocks to the subway, collar turned up against the wind, and boarded without thinking about the fact that I could have called for a car. The train smelled faintly of metal and coffee, the familiar sway rocking everyone into the same quiet rhythm. I glanced around at the faces. Construction workers with dust still on their boots, a nurse scrolling through her phone with tired eyes, a pair of teenagers laughing softly over something on a cracked screen. No one cared who I was. No one here measured worth by the price of a watch or the size of a contract. Gerald would have liked that. When I reached my stop, I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the cold biting harder now. My apartment was warm when I stepped inside, the heat humming softly in the background. I set my bag down, shrugged off my coat, and went straight to the small table by the window, where I always set my watch for the night. But instead of taking it off, I sat there for a while, my fingers tracing the smooth leather strap, the weight of it as familiar as my own heartbeat. I thought about that dinner, how one glance from my father had unraveled years of quiet, how quickly the currents in a room could shift when the truth finally found air. I thought about Zoe, walking out of my office with her head higher than when she'd walked in. I thought about my father's voice on the phone earlier this week, talking about wanting to leave something behind that mattered. The watch wasn't just a reminder of Gerald. It was proof of something I'd chosen every single day since he handed it to me, to live by impact, not image. And maybe, just maybe, that choice was starting to spread, to my family, to Zoe, to anyone who saw there was another way to measure a life. I finally slipped the watch off, setting it gently on the table. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, but the ticking filled the room with a calm steadiness. It didn't care about the noise of the world, it just kept moving forward. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Blake lit the screen. First solo session teaching at the youth program tonight. I think I finally get what you've been talking about all these years. I smiled, typing back a quick, proud of you, before setting it aside. The watch caught a glint of lamplight, the face glowing faintly, as if it knew something I didn't. Somewhere in the quiet, I realized this wasn't the end of anything. The dinner had been a beginning, the first crack in a wall that had been standing for years. And through that opening, more light was bound to come in, along with questions I hadn't decided if I'd answer, because sooner or later, my father was going to ask for the full story. And when he did, I'd have to decide just how much truth I was ready to put on the table. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed how people saw you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If this one kept you hooked, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next twist-filled chapter. There are so many more stories waiting for you, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.